Good afternoon, everyone. As you said, my name is Leslie Wilson, and we have an excellent panel for everyone on the call today. So I'm Leslie, and I'm the Policy Assistant at Casey Healthy Kids. On the panel, we have Patricia Miller. She is the Chief Executive Officer for the Missouri State Alliance of YMCAs. We also have Natasha Frost, who's a staff attorney at the Public Health Law Center. And finally, Kelly Hopkins with Board Services for the Missouri School Board Association. A little overview of where we'll be going today, what we'll be talking about. We are going to give you an overview of the project, talk about why community use in schools, talk about a survey that we did in Missouri schools, as well as recommendations and liability and insurance questions and comments, as well as the role of the Missouri School Boards Association in this effort, and then we will be taking questions at the end.
Great, this is Patty Miller, and I will give you a little bit of history on the project and when it began. In 2013, the Missouri State Alliance for YMCAs here in Missouri received a small amount of funding from the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation to look at healthy eating and active living policy in Missouri and identify opportunities for growth and improvement of that policy. We put together a statewide team to focus on childhood obesity, and one of the goals of that initial team was to improve built environment so that families and children can utilize their communities and neighborhoods for physical activity. From that goal grew an effort to really look at community use in the state of Missouri and try to identify kind of the who, what, where, and why around community use, focusing on barriers and what we can do to break those down. So the Missouri State Alliance of YMCAs contracted with a couple of different partners, including Casey Healthy Kids and the Public Health Law Center, to bring the energy and resources and expertise around this to Missouri and design a project to both get input and give feedback around the status and what we can do to advance the opportunity for children and families to have areas in their communities for safe play locally. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Natasha Frost with Public Health Law Center to walk us through the project and the initial survey, and I'll turn it over.
Great. So many of you may be thinking, hey, what's the Public Health Law Center? Well, we're a nonprofit organization that's located in St. Paul, Minnesota. So this is a picture of our campus. I'm very remiss to have to switch that out for a winter slide, which is happening fairly soon here. We are a nonprofit organization that works with stakeholders from around the country to try and promote public health laws related to healthy, affordable food access, active transportation and active play, tobacco control, and many other public health concepts. So we work directly with stakeholders like Casey Healthy Kids and others as part of this effort to try and dig down and figure out what are the barriers to policy change and what are the opportunities. And as part of this effort, we helped design a survey tool that we'll go over today, as well as outlining a few resources, again, that we'll talk about today. So let's just dive right in because there's lots to cover. And so I wanted to start out by first taking a step back and having a conversation about what are we talking about when we're talking about community use. Community use is fairly simple. It is just the concept that folks in the community can use school property for purposes of recreation. And so that's just, when we use that term community use of school property, that's what it means. So people coming onto the property to use the playgrounds, the track, to use the gym for a pickup game of basketball, or to walk the hallways. Now this can be accomplished through a formal or informal agreement, so either a written piece of paper saying, hey, I want to use this property, or a handshake between a school district and another entity. It could also be accomplished, and we're going to go into more detail on this one, by a policy that's enacted by a school or a school district that really just opens up the school property for use by government or non-governmental entities, or just actually saying, hey, public, come on board for an open, or come onto our property for an open gym event to have fun and recreate. So there's a lot of different names that we use for community use, so I just want to flag a few because, you know, there's different ways that people talk about this. So community use is really what the schools are using. That's the term that the schools use, and that grows out of really what the school board policies say. So community use of school property is generally what the school administrators, what they're talking about. That's the term that they use. But for public health folks and other folks that are working in this field, they might use things like shared use, facility use, open use is another term that's used, public use, or joint use. So those are different terms that are used in this space, but they all mean the same thing, which is essentially, hey, community, adults and kids, come onto our school property and have fun and recreate. So this is just kind of shows you the gamut and the spectrum of opportunities. So we have folks playing a pickup game of soccer, an open gym, maybe a basketball game, a meeting, or a specific event like a youth lock-in. So those are all sorts of examples that are being used, that community groups are using for school property for to recreate. So then the question is like, why? Why would the schools open up their doors? They have their hands full in educating our kids. Well, there's a lot of really important reasons why schools would open up their doors for community use. So one really strong reason is to maximize the use of school facilities. So there are a lot of great opportunities during non-school hours where school facilities are not being used by the students or by the school, and so using those and maximizing that community resource is really important. We found that through studies that community use is actually a way to address the health needs of students and the community. So when students are more physically active or a community is more physically active, that actually translates to a reduction in chronic diseases, things like diabetes or heart disease in the long run. And so it actually helps, using the school space for community recreation can actually help the overall health of the community. What we've also found is that it really does build support for the schools. There are a lot of school districts that have community members that are trying to garner support for their bond measures or for their different initiatives for funding at the local level, yet they don't have kids at that school. And so community use is a phenomenal way to actually build that community collaboration so that when that bond measure comes up, you've got that community support for folks who might not have schools that are going to school at that time, or that don't have kids going to school at that time. It also actually is a phenomenal place for recreation where really opportunities are limited. And this is really apparent in our rural communities and our low-income communities. Often schools are the very hub of the community, the lifeblood of the community, and so using those spaces for recreation can be really critical. And then finally, what we're finding in the evidence is that students who are actually more physically active, not just during the school day, but overall, have better academic performance. And so that is actually, those are the various reasons why we want to open up our schools for community use. And so just overall, studies have shown that children and adults with more active, that have more active areas and more recreational opportunities are more active and are healthier. All right, so the next kind of concept is like thinking about the barrier. So why doesn't every school do this? I mean, there are really concrete reasons why every school doesn't have some sort of recreational opportunity happening across their school property at all times during the day and night. And these are just some of the various kind of general nationally are some of the reasons that we found. So some of the barriers. So cost, the physical design sometimes can be a really big barrier. So the gym might be right next to the computer lab, and actually having community access could be either a safety risk to the students or actually create, a increased risk of theft. There's kind of operational things like things like decision making and scheduling, like how is that going to happen? How are we going to operationalize community use? In some communities, there just aren't the community groups to actually request the opportunities to use the school, and there's no programming for students and communities once the school doors are open. And then finally, liability and risk management have been kind of flagged as a reason of a barrier to community use of school property. So those are kind of the national barriers, and when we started this project, we thought, okay, well, we need to figure out what's up in Missouri, because every state's different, every local government is different. And so what we came up with as a team is figuring out a survey that would survey the school administrators from their perspective about community use. And we also did a survey for end users. And what I mean by end users is just the folks who are using school property. And so I'm going to go over those survey results right now. And I will say it's also in this resource that's pictured right here in the webinar and is on our website, which I'll give a link to you at the end. So the first set of surveys went to school administrators, and we were really excited because we collected 81 responses, and this was over the course of a couple months. And we had a wide variety of respondents, superintendents, facility managers, principals, other folks who are really important in community use, like the activities directors or the nurses. And we had a huge range of levels of experience, not expertise, but experience in that position. So anywhere from a brand new in that position all the way up through 20 years. And we were really very targeted in our outreach to make sure that every single part of Missouri was represented. And so these are the areas we have broad participation across the different areas and regions of Missouri, as you can see here. And we also wanted to make sure that we had broad representation from all types of communities. And so we did a very targeted effort to make sure that the very small communities were represented as well as the very large. And so we didn't have that large rural representation, but we think it's because folks kind of self-selected into the either isolated or small rural, and then in the suburban, metropolitan, urban. But we had a very good cross-section across the state. So what did we find? And the way that we're going to kind of release this information is we're going to identify some of the highlights of the survey, not all of the information. So if you want all the details, just let us know. We can send you a more detailed summary. But what we found is that community use is happening. This is something we thought, but we now know that school districts are already doing a great job about opening up their doors to certain facilities. So we've got great use in gymnasiums and sports fields, and then there's also some work that can be done in the types of facilities that would be open to the public, things like playgrounds and cafeterias and hallways, especially during the winter months. So this graphic actually shows you kind of what factors the school administrators were thinking about when they wanted to open up their doors. What was actually making them open up the doors? And it was really fascinating to have them rank these different considerations. And so you'll look at the bottom end of the scale is what they ranked as the most important. And so it's in kind of the public service and building partnerships were really important to school administrators, and that was really a driving force for opening up the doors. And so there's some really important opportunities. And if you look at kind of the other end of the spectrum, that things were less important. So things like administrative efficiency and cost sharing were not as important as those other key relationship building components. And so when we asked them, what the school administrators, what was not allowing you to, what was actually prohibiting you or was kind of in your decision-making would create a barrier to opening up the doors, the key factor that was identified were liability concerns as well as just safety and equipment concerns, and insurance. So those were kind of at that end of the scale, that those were the things that were identified as, boy, if I'm making the decision to not allow community use, that's what I'm thinking about is liability, safety, and insurance. So that was really important information. And then we wanted to kind of figure out, okay, well, you identified liability. What sort of liability protection do you think you have? And so we actually had them rate what level of liability protection they thought they had if there was injury during the school day during a formal agreement. So these are things like there's something in writing or there's a formal agreement between an entity and the school district. And as you can see here, there's a lot of respondents who said, you know, we have really good liability protection. Where they felt a little less sure is in those informal or unscheduled use of school property, so playground, track, you know, people just come into the track and walk on the track, that sort of activity. So kind of you're going to see this image a lot. So these are our key takeaways from the survey. So one of the key takeaways from this information was that although Missouri actually offers strong liability protection for schools for allowing community use of school property during non-school hours, which I will talk about in a minute, you know, there is strong protection, but, and there's insurance coverage that can fill in the gaps. It's just there's a necessity for training and resources to really share that information for school administrators so they don't actually have the concern about liability, so that it's actually not allowing them to open up their school doors. So that training and resource component was a key takeaway from this information. All right, so just kind of going back to that insurance question, we wanted to figure out, okay, insurance is a critical risk management strategy, which we'll talk about a little later, but what are you having for insurance? So we asked the school administrators that, and by and large, as you can see, over 73% use the Missouri United School Insurance Council, MUSAC. So there is one insurance company that insures the majority of school districts that were surveyed in Missouri, and anecdotally is the largest insurer of school districts in Missouri. And so therefore, it's that is a critical partner in the conversation about opening up the doors for community use. And when asked about what was the best protection for liability, insurance and school board policy really ranked the highest. And so really working with partners like MUSAC and others who are creating school board policy are going to be really critical in kind of trying to unpeel that onion of liability in Missouri so that school districts, again, can feel comfortable opening up their doors for community use. All right, so another key takeaway that we found, and we're going to get to this in a little bit, is that creative funding streams and shared revenue can be really important options for community use. So like small investments like hallway gates can really increase the community use of school property. And where we found that key takeaway is when we asked slides are out of order here. So this is where's that written guidance from? And so what we find, just you can see here, the written guidance for community use is school board policies are the critical component for how schools are using their community use, or how they're implementing community use. All right, so going back to that, the key takeaway is that written policies and procedures are really guiding student administrators and how they're going to incorporate best practices. And we're going to talk about how we are using this key takeaway to improve that environment, that policy environment for schools across Missouri. All right, going back to those costs, we have one of the biggest things that school administrators said was that costs are a key barrier. And we're going to talk a little more in our recommendation section about what other communities across the country have kind of innovative practices for addressing the costs. Things like gates, again, that concept of if a facility is the barrier and the open gym is not an option because your computer lab is right next door, or maybe you have the kindergarten room that you feel like there's a safety concern. Many school districts actually, or school administrators reported, hey, we want to actually have a gate to actually separate those two facilities or those two spaces of our facility, or we don't want to give out keys to everyone in the community because then we'll have to rekey the whole school, and so maybe a fob or some other sort of kind of small investment can improve community use, and that's that cost perspective. All right, so now moving to end users. So the end users, again, are those folks that are using school property, either as an entity like the YMCA, or the YMCA, or the Boys and Girls Club, or a community member. And what was really important when we surveyed these folks, and we got 169 responses over the course of 3 months, what we really wanted to do was get a wide range of users, so not just the YMCAs, right? We wanted to get the 4-H clubs, K-12, other child care providers, and so you can see by this wheel of color that we have a lot of different types of community users, end users, from our survey. And again, we wanted to make sure that we had a wide range by region, which we did, and we also wanted to have kind of a spectrum of the spectrum from isolated, the non-metro, all the way through the urban metro, which again, we were able to accomplish through targeted outreach. All right, when we talked about kind of what facilities were you using as an end user, we wanted to make sure that these end users were in fact using schools. And so the majority of our respondents were actually using schools for their community use. So, but there were also other opportunities identified, which I think is a really important takeaway as well. Like, there are other options for community use to try and recreate in a particular community, things like faith-based, other kind of public-private partnerships and parks are really critical in the whole, thinking about how to get communities healthy and active. Thinking about all the different places to recreate is going to be really important moving forward. All right, but we really wanted to focus in on schools for this purpose, for this survey. And so we just asked, what if you had an increased access to facilities, would you have more programming that was more physical activity in your programming? And there was this resounding yes. And so we took that as a thumbs up of yes, end users it's really important for them to have access to facilities. And if they have access to facilities, they will be more physically active. And so what we wanted to then do, so that was our takeaway, like, yes, figuring out ways to make more facilities available is a critical component to making communities more physically active. All right, so then we try to see, what were they denied use of school property? And so the three kind of main reasons why folks were denied, and you'll see here that the majority of folks were not denied community use of school property. That's important to understand that schools are actually really doing a great job at community use. But there is some room for improvement, and the key reasons were that there's not a space available, the school has first priority, and then there's this liability and insurance that came up again from the end user perspective. So thinking about ways to maximize school property, if there's not space, thinking about other space that could be available, again, and being from Minnesota and having a long winter, there are lots of school districts that are using the hallways for walking clubs. So thinking creatively about space is a really important takeaway, and maximizing scheduling. So there were a lot of barriers identified, or we actually asked about which was the biggest barrier to incorporating more physical activity, and this cost and access to facilities were the key components to that. So the end users were saying, we would increase physical activity if the space wouldn't cost so much, if it wouldn't cost so much to have staffing from our own perspective, or if we had access to more facilities. So a lot of this was more about kind of that open-ended answers on the end user survey, and I just want to flag that a lot of our survey respondents were really supportive of the fantastic work that schools do and the relationships that they've built with the schools. That was a theme throughout these surveys. And then they also identified that written agreements were really helpful to make sure that they knew what they were supposed to be doing and that the schools knew what they knew what the schools were supposed to be covering. And so having that meeting of the minds of like, oh yes, I know that I'm supposed to be taking out the garbage at the end of my event. That's not the school's duty. It's my responsibility, or that the schools are responsible for locking up after an event. That sort of communication was really critical. Also, they really did say that the space availability, especially in the winter, is a critical barrier because schools are using those facilities during the winter. And there was a theme of the last-minute cancellations by the schools were a problem. And then finally, that cost component was another identifying barrier. So some takeaways from the responses, just the themes were scheduling is a really important thing for school districts and community groups to figure out. Transportation, especially in rural areas, can be a really big barrier. So figuring out how to get community and kids to the school property from remote rural locations you have to think about that when you're opening up the school doors. Limited hours, especially during summer months and over holidays, can be a problem. And then the cost for that rent and staff time. And then, you know, there were a few that said that those bad experiences, those bad relationships that were created from a particular experience with the school district could really kind of poison the well, if you might say, for future community use of school property and actually just for the relationship between the school and community group in general. So those kind of key takeaways are things like to figure out how do we address those through policy and practice, through scheduling, transportation costs, and hours. And again, I want to just highlight this because it just continued to be a theme that these successful partnerships were really about good communication, written agreements, sharing of spaces, so give and take, and then a group, an actual entity that would help navigate this sort of work. And where that came up from both the end user and the school administrators was just time. School administrators are doing a lot of work. They have a lot of stuff on their plate, and so do community groups. And so having an entity that helps bridge the gap, identify opportunities with some kind of successes that were found in the kind of the highlighting success stories in our survey. So based on that information, we identified that tools are really critical. So developing tools, helping schools and community groups come from a place of understanding from the very beginning, so written tools, and then also building off successes is key to moving this effort forward and improving on the already great work that's happening. We also wanted to ask about food because the effort does include not just access to physical activity opportunities, but we know the importance of healthy food access. And so we asked our end users if they were serving food to the participants, and a little under half were serving food during their programming. And as you can see by this graphic, over half had a practice of serving healthy choices, but much less had a written policy that really defined what was quote-unquote healthy. And there was also a sizable portion of those that did not serve healthy food or did not know or didn't have those nutrition standards. And so when we asked kind of what was the barrier to having healthy food, the biggest, and this is consistent across a lot of the different efforts that we are embarking upon for healthy food access, was the cost. And then not insignificant, though, was the barrier of having access to kitchen facilities and refrigeration. And so, when looking at a comprehensive community use strategy, incorporating these kind of concepts are going to be really important. So thinking about how can active physical activity programming actually incorporating healthy food and have access to either refrigeration or kitchen facilities is an important strategy to provide a holistic vision of health for students and community members. So based on all this information, we sorted through and we pulled out 5 key recommendations. And so the first one was to try and figure out how to update community use policies and procedures across the board. So how do we incorporate these components into the written work that school districts are using, not just in their school board policies, but in their procedures, in their websites, in their forms, and in their student and parent handbooks. Because all of that goes to that kind of the public face of, hey, our doors are open, come on over and use our schools to recreate. And then as part of that conversation is the next recommendation, which is trying to figure out, okay, how can we demystify liability to the best of our ability and kind of figure out that insurance kind of disconnect for school administrators. And then there's this kind of catch-all for creating other tools that support community use and also best practices for scheduling, because scheduling kept coming up, and so there are some innovative approaches in different communities about how to schedule use, not just in the school's property, but also linking in to other property that's available for community use, things like parks, things like, faith-based organizations. Those are all kind of innovative practices that communities identified as kind of creating a holistic recreational space for the community. And then finally, but very important, is figuring out how can we fund schools to create a lot of these kind of nominal improvements to increase access to the school property. Things like hallway gates or rekeying their system to have fobs or other electronic ways in and out of the school property that could really facilitate community use. So we kind of jumped in as an attorney, and as having worked in several different states on the issue of liability, the Public Health Law Center identified liability as one of those things where, hey, we have that information, let's figure out if we can just put it into a document for school administrators so they can look at that and figure out whether or not, just to kind of get a sense of what liability is like in Missouri. And so we created this resource, Demystifying Missouri Liability and Insurance. And so when folks think about liability, essentially what it means is somebody is hurt, and based on that injury, they incur cost, either emotional cost because they're going through pain and suffering, or they actually have a medical bill. So that's kind of this idea of, that's what we were talking about when we talked about liability in this sense. There's lots of forms of liability. That's what we're talking about today. And so when you're talking about liability, and this is all laid out in this resource. There's like 4 elements, and I'm not going to go into this because it will take me back to law school, which I do not want to do. I love law school because I'm located in one. But I don't want to go back to first-year torts. But there's 4 elements. So there's the duty of care. So the idea is that I owe somebody a duty to protect them when they come onto my school property. And then breach. So I failed to actually live up to that duty to protect them. And then the third thing is damage, and as a result of that breach of duty, they incurred some sort of damage. So their car was scratched, their ankle was broken, that's the damage. And then finally, it was based on my failure that they were injured. So that is a key component to this kind of elements of liability. And the really critical one when we're talking about school administrators is, what is the duty of care? So this is kind of a summary of this legal responsibility. And so there's this huge gamut of responsibility for folks that we live, every day we walk out our front door, we owe people a duty of care. Any one of us can be sued at any moment if we cause an injury. So this is the world that we live in, and so this is kind of a summary of, there are situations where on the kind of lower end of the scale, you can't, it's called willful wanton conduct in some states, and it's this idea that unless you behave really, really badly, you are not going to be liable in court. All the way through this concept of strict liability, which is generally held for food safety requirements, or product liability, where it's like you owe the public such a high level of duty because you're serving them food or because you're creating a toy. And so even if you didn't do anything wrong, if that product creates an injury, you are still responsible. So that's kind of the gamut. And right there in the middle, that negligence standard, that reasonable person standard is where we usually sit. So I walking out of my front door, owe everyone in my community a duty to be reasonable. I cannot walk up to somebody at a crosswalk and push them into oncoming traffic. That is not reasonable. And so it's just this concept of like, you have to be reasonable, you have to behave reasonably. Where that gets difficult is when you're an entity like a school district. Folks see you kind of as a deep pocket because you're bigger than an individual person. And so having that reasonable person standard can really result in high levels of litigation to try and figure out whether or not what you did as a school district was reasonable. And so knowing that, we want to look at kind of what is the duty of schools in Missouri. And so overall, Missouri law requires that school boards maintain the buildings in good repair. This is a standard, and this makes sense. There are students on the school property all day, having electrical wires hanging out of the wall, or having, scaffolding that could fall on a child at any moment during a gym class is like not, That's not what we want to promote within a healthy space for our kids. And so Missouri law requires that everything be in good repair and that the grounds are safe for both students and the public. This is the basic standard in Missouri. So what does that mean? Well, that means that if something happens and the school board violates that and they go to court, there is another protection for school districts in Missouri, and that's called immunity. And what immunity means is that, you know, I'm doing my best as a school district to provide a safe space. Something happened. I tried to meet that reasonable person standard, but in fact, you know, I was not able, you know, something happened and somebody was injured. And unless I behaved really badly, I'm going to be immune from that lawsuit, because otherwise the school boards would be weighed down litigating every single injury on their property. That's kind of the concept of immunity. It's where it comes from. It's the idea that governments to function have to have some level of protection from immunity. Missouri school boards have this level of immunity protection, and what that means is they have a level of protection so that unless they behave really badly, unless they do something so that they create an unsafe environment for the public, affirmatively create an unsafe environment, that they can have a litigation protection from lawsuits. There's also another level, and this is all described in this fact sheet, so I would encourage you to go through the fact sheet to get this overview as well. There's also a level of protection for officials, so not the school districts as an entity, but also individuals. It's a pretty complicated legal analysis, but in sum what it means is that if I'm a school official and I am making decisions to the best of my expertise, so I'm like making a call on whether or not to do this or that, you may have a level of protection based on that decision. And we go through a case in the fact sheet where a member of the Department of Transportation for a school, there was a school bus accident, and so this official had protection because based on his expertise of figuring out how to run the transportation system in the school district, how to get kids to and from, the years of experience, and he showed all this to the court. Because of that, he had protection because the decision that he made on how to run that route was based on his discretionary actions. And this is compared to this ministerial actions, which is essentially a rubber stamp. So a process that's in place for you. You don't make a decision based on your best judgment. It's kind of made for you based on policy or based on, you know, something that you're required to do as part of your job. And this kind of leads me to this thing of, so this is complicated, and lawyers' favorite answer is usually it depends. And so really when you're talking about this liability issue, although we are trying to demystify it to the best of our ability, really when you're talking about a specific fact pattern or a specific situation, like if you want to figure out, okay, I know that my playground has some deficiencies, and I want to make sure that the public is protected. What do I need to do to make sure that the public's protected, but also I am protected under liability? And so that is something that's very fact-specific, and you really need to contact the attorney as a school administrator. So that's the liability question, but as an attorney, I always think about like that, you've already kind of lost the battle if somebody is injured. And so a really critical component of this is figuring out the risk management strategies to prepare to avoid the injury in the first place. So in the fact sheet that we have, we actually lay out a list of risk management strategies. Certainly not all of the things you can do for risk management, but it is definitely a list that you can go to and reference. So it's things like creating clear policies, having a record of why you made the decision that you made, training staff, having a review of those policies and procedures, eliminating dangers, documenting everything. You know, these are all really critical, and at the very end here is having liability insurance. So as we said, MUSAC is a really important component for the insurance in Missouri. And so they have a great website that lists out insurance. And so I'd encourage you to take a look there or ask your own insurance company, like how much you're covered. And then finally, you know, having clear policies, and we're going to pass it to Kelly here, but really important is having clear school board policies and procedures. And I am thrilled because the Minnesota School Board Association has really comprehensive policies, procedures, and forms related to community use. And with that, I will pass it off to Kelly.
Hi, glad you joined us today. This won't take long. We've got 3 basic policies, or 3 basic documents that deal with community use of facilities. The first is our policy. The second is our procedure, and those of you who are familiar with our processes, our policy is the general statement of the board's intent that we want to open our district facilities to the community. The procedure is a description of how the community is going to access those, including some of the rules for how to obtain access, what to do while you're in them. And then we have a form that is an application for a permit to use those district facilities. If your district is an MSBA member, all of those are available on our website. I do want to tell you that if you were to type this into Google, like community use of district facilities, KG, you're going to get several hundred, perhaps even thousands of responses, and that's because several districts in the state of Missouri have adopted these. It's probably the most common policy you ran into. They're about 75%. But districts have the ability to customize those. So, and that's both good and bad. Usually good, but occasionally there are some changes that we wouldn't have approved of had they asked us. But you can see our basic policies here, and then you can see those that belong to school districts, other school districts. I do want to mention, this is not on the slide, and then we'll move on, but you can just, if you want to, just go ahead and show them what we've got. But I did want to tell you, these are just screenshots of the policy and that sort of thing to tell you what they kind of look like. I did look it up, and in our wellness procedure, we actually reference, you know, we want to find ways to open our community, our facilities to the community to help promote health, wellness among our staff, among our students, and among members of the community. Not just, you know, the wellness policy and procedure address activity during the school day, but after the school day and in summers and at times when the district isn't using the facility. So that's already a component of ADF-AP1, if you're on our policy services, that's the wellness procedure. And then we also have the procedure, and the procedures look just pretty much the same as the policies. And then we have the form, which is where we go in, and we are going to look at these after working with this group. We're going to go back and we're going to review some of their recommendations about policy and some of their findings from this study, and we will be making some adjustments to our policy, procedures, and forms to balance the need for school districts to use their facilities versus the very good things that happen when school districts open their facilities to the community.
All right, so as I said, we have gone through and done a detailed analysis of all of the different school board policies, which, wow, there were a lot in Missouri, and identified whether or not they use MSBA's procedures, policy and procedures, and if they did, if they use the template, which template they used, I mean, because there's so many over the years. And so that's going to be on our website. So for those of you and users who are working in particular communities or school administrators and advocates, we'll have all of that information on our website, and that information will be available to you. And so I'm just going to take you back to that website. And then that's where the website that's specific to this Missouri work. And, you know, we also have the 2 resources that I went over as well as the link to the webinar. So with that information, we're going to open it up to questions, and so I'm going to pass it back to Leslie.
Yeah, all right. So now is the time. If you have any questions, go ahead and enter them in the Q&A box. We have about 10 minutes left on the webinar, so any questions you have, go ahead and type those in, and we will try to get to as many as we can. So I am going to just kind of start with a general question, and Kelly, this might relate to some MSBA policies, but if a community group is wanting to get engaged with schools, what is the first step that they should take in going about to connecting with the school, getting permission? What's that initial step look like?
The first step I would advise them to do is to go on the district's website and look for their community use policy. That will usually give them the contact information they need to follow up, and it will tell them whether or not that policy or that procedure, and if they have their forms posted, their forms, how to access the use on the community. And in Missouri, all school districts, if they have a website, are supposed to have their policies and related documents on that website. So that would be my first stop. If not, call the superintendent's office.
Great, thank you. And Natasha, could you go back a couple slides and put back up the website that all of the information from this webinar will be located on? Perfect. Okay, let's see here. In this research, this could apply to any of the panelists probably, but cost was noted as, a significant and, very common barrier to accessing schools. Do any schools not charge or charge a lesser fee for certain community groups or maybe nonprofits? Did you find that in any of the research?
Well, I don't know about what their research showed, but I just know from my personal experience working with school districts in the state and their policies, there are lots of districts who charge absolutely nothing for access to their facilities. And the ones who do charge, I can't speak for all of them, but most of them tend to charge almost exactly what it costs. For instance, if we have to pay someone $10 to go in and sweep up after, then they charge them $10. So there are very few times when a school district will charge a high amount for use of the facilities, although I know it might happen occasionally.
Yeah, and from our research, we didn't specifically focus on the fee schedules, but I know that in other parts of the country, we have used that as an opportunity for community engagement in addressing a fee schedule that really allowed for fee waivers or a sliding scale specifically for nonprofits and that serve community groups in the district.
And I would add, this is Kelly again, I would add that I do know we have school districts that when the activity involves children, that they are seldom, they always waive fees when it involves children.
Yeah, and I know that another issue that comes up with costs are for groups that don't necessarily have insurance, and so insurance can be a barrier. So the school districts will often require that the user group have insurance, and that could be cost prohibitive for really small nonprofits that run programming. In Wisconsin, there was a great example of a nonprofit group that served Somali youth that didn't necessarily run physical activity programming, so they didn't have insurance for that, that wanted to have a swim class. And so it was just an opportunity for collaboration and partnership in order to figure out and they actually found a way to provide for a one-time insurance coverage for that group and used a community partnership to pay for that cost. And there are also innovative ways to have the district, add for a one-time use fee or something, add on to their own insurance coverage. And so the idea is it's an opening point for conversation and communication. And I'd just say that, often administrators are really, really busy, and it's hard to actually find time and space for that communication. And that's where, our group identifying a champion for community use in a community can be a really critical first step in just trying to have somebody help manage the different requests and help support the school districts in that effort and identify solutions to some of those problems.
Great, thank you. Okay, we have a couple more questions that came in. So when asking for a certificate of insurance to protect the district, is the risk of injury taken into consideration in following the minimum insurance requirements? And the example was kind of like a DJ versus, someone coming in to do tree work where they could have, power tools.
Based on our research, the answer is no, that it's generally there is one fee for all because injuries can happen at any time, and that extremely dangerous activities or activities that might be specifically excluded from the school district's insurance, and like a bouncy house is coming to mind, or a rock climbing wall, like those sorts of things might require extra coverage. But the minimum fee is generally, what we found is generally the same, just because the risk of, you know, somebody tripping and falling or something happening on the school property is the same regardless of the activity.
Okay. And then are there any policies in place that handle potential discrimination against groups if so relating to if a school district was more open to renting facility space for a certain group but not another?
Well, anything that would negatively impact a protected class. For instance, if we're going to allow youth sports teams to use the facilities, of course we're going to allow all of them, even those that are run by religious organizations. And that would go back to the district's basic statement on non-discrimination, and our community use policy also addresses the fact that we treat everybody the same based on the activity that they are engaging in. It has nothing to do with the source behind it.
Where that does come into play is not based on the user, it's the class or the tax status of the user group. I've seen it, there is a separate treatment from a cost perspective in some communities related to for-profit versus nonprofit, or for groups serving non-district members. So, you know, something that actually, and that goes to the mission of the school district, so that makes sense, but it's not based on any protected class.
Okay. And let's see here. Okay. When renting out a school facility and wanting to use, let's say, the gym, hallways, and the kitchen, would that still be like the same liability form, or since the kitchen would then be used for preparing food and the food safety comes into play, would a more stricter form or course of action need to be taken?
Yeah, so the way that, and again, it will vary district by district. Generally speaking, when you rent or reserve a space in the school district, it will depend on the space, and so there might be an additional cost just associated with the rental of the space. I will say there are extra considerations when you're talking about the cafeteria that serves children, and the reason for that is that that is a food establishment facility, and so anyone who, and again, I'm generalizing here because I don't know specific laws in Missouri. I do know it applies because we saw it in the policies, but there are requirements that food establishments must follow for who can be in the facility running food preparation. And so oftentimes it's an increased cost, not from a liability perspective, but it's an increased cost from a perspective of like staffing, because you actually have to have a food safety certified person on site, or you have to have a food service person on site because the food that's served to the kids is actually accessible to the public, and so it has to be managed. And so there is some additional cost, not necessarily from a liability perspective, but from a kind of a rental cost and staffing from the school district side cost that have to be considered. But there are some innovative ways around that as well. So some facilities have other refrigeration units or allow for reoccurring use by a particular nonprofit. They actually allow them to have a small refrigerator on site to store their own food. There are also, and it's kind of it's not as common anymore, but like home ec rooms that have facilities that don't rise to the same level of certification and kind of food safety requirements or food establishment requirements. And so it just depends on the space. And so one of the things that we found with this issue related to food is that honestly, it's just talking with the district and coming up with a plan, identifying creative solutions, pulling in other strategic partners And that's, again, why having somebody outside and kind of in tracking best practices in a community can actually help with that for multiple organizations.
Great. Thank you, Natasha, for that answer. All right, well, that is going to be our last question of the day. I just wanted to, on behalf of the panel and myself, thank everyone again for participating in the community use webinar. I hope you found it useful. And just a reminder, all of the policy documents that Natasha and the panelists referenced will be on the community use website that is that's still on the screen right now. And so make sure to check those out. And the webinar will also be posted to that website as well because it was being recorded. So, and definitely if you have any questions that didn't get answered, go ahead and email Natasha Frost, and she will do her best to get that question answered for you. So thanks again, and have a great rest of your Thursday, and good luck with community use.